Yep. Yep.
We've got one chat already. Is that anybody having trouble connecting, Alana?
The chat.
Not showing up
Hang on.
That's odd.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, let's
Oh,
see if does the microphone work? It sounds like no. Okay,
I wonder if,
maybe on Zoom.
yeah. Oh, okay.
What'd you say, Alana? We're good to go. Okay. Okay, I'll just hold the microphone up just for kicks. It's a really exciting day. So glad to see such a lovely audience here to support Jes on their big day. So I just want to tell you a little bit about Jes. I first heard from them in fall of 2019. I like to use these as opportunities to go back and do a little trip down memory lane for our benefit. Anyway, Jes sent along their resume inquiring about a position in my lab, and I was looking over the resume, and there were just a lot of really interesting experiences, a very long list of scholarships, so many recognitions that my printer actually stopped working.
Oh.
It just got tired of printing out all of your accomplishments. So Jes came with just a lot of really interesting experiences. They had worked more than 1,700 hours for the Minnesota Green Corps. In addition to working in the Finlay and Hobby and Tillman labs at University of Minnesota, as a Minnesota graduate myself, go Gophers, I was super excited to see their strong connections to Minnesota. In addition to that, Jes was really trying to get this grad student process figured, applying to grad school, the process figured out, and was doing informational interviews all over the place, including with my former PhD advisor, Sue Galadowicz, who then immediately sent me an email. You really need to think strongly about taking Jes on. Jes is going to be a great student. So, and then I called Jes's references. An hour and a half later, after talking to Kathy Geist, who had a lot of great things to say about Jes, I figured at that point, if somebody would champion Jes so strongly, for an hour and a half, talked about their qualifications and qualities, I figured this was going to be a good fit. One of the things that's really fantastic about being an advisor is learning about other people's lives and seeing their different lived experiences and how they choose to be whole people and the impact that they have, even outside of academia. And in Jes's case, I personally have been really inspired by their environmental activism work that they've been doing on top of their coursework and their really interesting research as well. So some of you may realize, probably all of you have heard about the so-called restoration in Utah Lake, the Islands project, as well as the proposed housing development and water ski park in Logan. And Jes really dove right in and played a key role in some of the environmental activism that has been happening both in Cache Valley as well as statewide in trying to combat those projects. So just really impressive work on that. So when I secured the funding for the project that Jes worked on, it was a new project to work on Utah Lake. We had not, lots of people in our department have worked on Utah Lake, but we had not. And the question was, could we apply what we were learning in Great Salt Lake wetlands to a totally different system that had dramatically changing water levels? They had the same invasive Phragmites problem, but we knew that we were going to be put to the test. And so I knew that the student that came on here was going to require some creative problem solving, a whole lot of grit, and just being willing to dive in. And we just had to kind of see what was going to work, what was going to happen. So I think you'll be really interested to hear about Jes's research today and their really interesting research findings. So I will turn it over to Jes now.
Well, thank you, Karin, for that wonderful introduction. I may have teared up just a little bit. I didn't know some of those tidbits, so that was really nice to hear. Can everybody hear me okay and on Zoom land? Okay, great. I have my little clipped mic here. So, all right, well, I'm thrilled. Well, one, thank you for joining me today. I'm so thrilled to see so many amazing faces in the audience. I'm a little emotional about it in a great way. And I am just very excited to share the culmination of my master's research with you. If I had to surmise the research into one title, I would say it's Runaway Lakeshores and Widespread Plant Invasions. And these are insights on revegetating wetlands in the arid West. So yeah, if you don't already know me, which I'm sure you all do, my name is Jes Braun, and then this work was done under the great guidance of my advisor, Dr. Karin Kettering. And this was done with support from her Wetland Ecology and Restoration Lab and the Quinney College of Natural Resources here at Utah State University. All right. So let's see if this will advance. Okay, great. So let's just jump right in. Here is an overview of the journey that we are going to go on together today. First, I'll provide you a little background on why wetlands are important and how they have been negatively impacted. And I'm going to focus on the arid west region of the United States. And that will bring us into my research questions, which highlight current known gaps in research. And then I'll present some findings, which I'm excited to share. And then we'll back up a little bit the lens from focusing on Utah Lake, and we're going to look at how to revegetate wetlands in the more like larger Great Basin region through this creation of an upcoming extension publication. All right, so let's begin. We're going to start with the background. So as many of you know, the term wetland is very broad. It can take many forms. They're called rivers, marshes, bogs, mangroves, peatlands, mudflats. The list really can go on and continue for the rest of my presentation, but I will not put you through that. So they're often called the nurseries of life. Wetlands provide a habitat for thousands of species of aquatic and terrestrial plants and animals. As you know, migratory birds, especially here in Utah, use wetlands to rest and feed during their cross-continental journeys and as nesting sites when they're home. And I'd be remiss not to mention the aesthetic, recreational, and cultural values that wetlands provide as well. The benefits of wetlands really are as expansive and as inexhaustive as their many names. All right, you probably saw this coming. Here's the bad news. So we have actually lost 85% of our wetlands worldwide since 1700, which is a vast number to understand or contemplate. And that here in just our nation, we have lost 50% of original natural wetlands. And then this rate is actually 3 times faster in percentage terms than forest loss, excuse me. So the wetlands that are left are highly degraded, as you can see here in these photos. And so despite all the benefits provided by wetlands, we still continue to use about 60,000 acres of wetlands each year. So yeah, so this loss of habitat is made even more dire in the arid west of the United States. Wetlands are also negatively impacted by droughts, upstream water diversions, and those can increase water scarcity and dramatically change the water levels. All right, so I really love to read this quote by Annie Proulx, as I think it's really lovely and ties right into the research. So she says, "It is usual to think of the vast wetland losses as tragedy, with hopeless conviction that the past cannot be retrieved. Tragic indeed, and part of our climate change anguish. But as we learn how valuable wetlands are in softening the shock of the changing climate and how eagerly the natural world responds to concerned care, perhaps we can shift the weight of wetland destruction from inevitable to not on my watch." All right, so how do we do? What do we do? How do we help stop and reverse this destruction? All right, well, the first step is to understand the problems. In the Great Basin region here, which is highlighted on that map, there are several main threats to wetlands. We'll be speaking more in depth about 2 main ones, invasive plant species, and then drought and upstream water diversions. So touching on that first one, here's a deeper look at one particularly harmful plant invader, which is Phragmites australis. It wouldn't be Karn's lab if we didn't talk about Phragmites. And it was first recorded in Utah in 1983. It was introduced from its native habitat from Eurasia. It was likely brought over by ships inadvertently. And it is throughout much of North America. It's found mainly in wetlands, coastal habitats, and disturbed areas. So one of the reasons it's such an effective and great invader, if I can use that adjective, is that it creates dense and really monotypic stands with high seed rain, so the seeds can spread across the environment really easily, and it also has rapid rhizomatic spread on the ground. And so these stands can really outcompete and outshade native habitat, and they also can spread into open water areas, which makes them inaccessible to waterfowl and fish. So here in Utah, wetland managers spend hundreds of thousands of dollars each year on control, which is such a wild and high number. And this is usually the highest ticket item in management budgets. And it's just really one more threat to wetlands that are already in peril. All right, so the good news is it's working. So you can see this especially here in the north shore of Utah Lake, where they have been particularly successful at kind of beating back Phragmites. And although the Phragmites has been greatly reduced in this area, the native plant community is really not returning at the speed or diversity needed. So this area could then be potentially reinvaded if it's not restored or revegetated. So that brings me to the big question, and this is a big one. How do you restore the native plant community? Well, I will be covering two popular approaches. The first one is seeding. So why seed? It is the most cost-effective method, and it can increase biodiversity. Additionally, if you use locally sourced seeds, they can increase the chances of a successful restoration because those plants are already really adapted to that local climate and those local soil conditions, and then that will give them a higher chance of survival. So seeding is also very scalable, which is great, and it's the most time efficient. And so there are a few cons to seeding. Like I mentioned earlier, they are slow to grow, which can leave that ground vulnerable to invasion. And they also have quite high germination and establishment bottlenecks. So yeah, more on that note, it's found that 90 to 95% of seeding mortality happens in this germination and emergence stages of seeding's life cycle, meaning really only a small portion of seeds that are put out in the environment make it to that establishment stage. So there is a second popular approach that isn't seeding, so it's called plug planting. So for here, plugs are little young plants that are grown out in a greenhouse, and some of them are deep cones, this one here that I'm holding in this picture. And their deep cones can be really great for establishing longer roots before putting it out in the field. And so some pros of plug planting is that they can really establish quicker than seeds and bypass that germination bottleneck that we found. But the cons are they are more costly, they're more time and labor intensive to grow and install. All right, so now let's focus on where we're going to revegetate, which brings me to talk about my study site, which is Utah Lake, Utah. And I'm going to give a little primer on the lake in case you're unfamiliar. Utah Lake is one of the largest freshwater lakes west of the Mississippi River. It's located just south of the Great Salt Lake. It's connected by the Jordan River. It's a really important habitat for local and migratory birds. It's only home to the endemic fish, the dune sucker. It's very shallow and highly eutrophic, and it fluctuates in lake levels about 1 to 2 meters every year just naturally, but these fluctuations have been further impacted by historic drought. And then that orange star, if you can see up there on the top of that map, that is the site of my research. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about water level fluctuations because they are such an important part of my. So as I mentioned before, they can really happen naturally from wave action, but they've been driven to further extremes by upstream water use and that drought. And the drought that we're in. In the shallow lakes like the Utah Lake, they already naturally have high evaporation, and they can lose up to half of its volume per year just during the hot summer months. And then they also have higher fetch. And so fetch is like area where wind can just travel across the water unimpeded, and it really pushes the waves up on one side of that wind direction. So if you combine all these things together, you can really have great and unpredictable swings in levels. And that really makes defining the shoreline difficult, which is like one of the main parts of restoration. You have to know where to put the plants. So here is a visual to kind of be able to see exactly what's happening on site. So if you can see on the left picture, the picture was on installation day, and the ground was muddy. You can kind of see some footprints around it. The lake is really lapping at the edges. And then just a month later, the lake has already dropped drastically. So yeah, so what can we do? How can we revegetate these lakeshore systems in the face of these rapidly changing water levels and the threat of reinvasion by Phragmites and other species? So that brings me to my main research questions. So I have two questions that I'll cover. The first of the two questions is I was looking at how seeding density, and that elevation of planting would affect native and invasive plant success. So to do this, I tested a low density, which is like our 1x, or the typical recommended seeding density, which is 180 pure live seed per meter squared, against a high density, which is a 5x or 5 times that. So you may be asking why? Why should we manipulate seeding density? What would that do? Well, so this is kind of a one leads to the other leads to the other. So if you increase the seed amount, then you have those more seedlings that can cross that seed to seedling threshold where 99.5% mortality happens. And so if you have more seeds, you have more species established, and that will increase species richness and canopy complexity, which is great. And then if you have that increase in canopy complexity, then you have a higher likelihood that these species will be functionally different and that they can compete for resources against invasives. All right, so now what went into my seed mix? And I have it listed out there on the left. It's in alphabetical order by the Latin name. And there was a lot of thought that went into this. So I conducted a literature review of historic vegetation in the area. And I also worked with Utah Lake land managers to mine their expertise on what species that they were seeing that they were really highly successful at seeding. And then I also prioritized the species that our lab had been shown to have high competition success, especially against Phragmites. And the main 3 ones were all fast-growing natives that I have highlighted at the top. We have the Rumex maritimus or golden dock, the Disticus spicata or the saltgrass, and the Bidensternua or beggar tick. And to ensure maximum diversity for the seed mix, our lab follows really strict guidelines for collecting. And for that, we collected from at least 100 individuals of a species from at least 5 sites. And we made sure those sites were both hydrologically similar and spatially close to Utah. And then we stored those seeds dry at room temperature until we tested them for viability. And then we calculated our pure live seed rate off of that. And we also broke dormancy of these species depending on their species-specific protocols. All right, so now that will lead me into introducing my second question, which was plug-based. So it was, does the addition of plugs, the plug planting arrangement, and the elevation of planting impact native plant community recovery? All right, so similar question to the seeding density. Why should we manipulate plug planting arrangement? So in the literature, increasing, the density of plugs has been shown to bring positive effects. And these can include, they can harbor each other from wave action. So the ones on the outside can really protect the ones on the inside from getting beat up by waves. They decrease the soil evaporation through shading, which is great, so that leaves more water on site. And then they can increase water infiltration into the soil through the roots by having more roots around. And then there's a really cool phenomenon that happens where the leaky roots can provide oxygen to each other, and it's literally called leaky roots. And it especially happens in flooded conditions where one can at least release oxygen in that flooded conditions and the other ones can scoop it up. And of course, I put it in red here, there is a downside to increasing the density, and that could increase the competition for those resources between the plants. So this style of plug planting arrangements has been shown to be effective in coastal salt marshes, but really it has yet to be tested in lake systems. This is a pretty novel approach. All right, so you might be asking, what would that look like? What does manipulating plug planting arrangement look like? Well, I was able to test 2 different styles of planting, as you can see up here. The dispersed plug arrangement, where all the plants are about a ½ meter apart from each other in that kind of 3x3 grid, or a clumped plug arrangement where they're all like touching each other in the middle of the plot. And I was able to test 2 different species of plants on 2 different really spectrums of flooding and drought tolerance. We have the hard stem bulrush, which really can handle inundation levels and almost thrives in flooding conditions, and saltgrass, which one of its other common names is desert saltgrass. It really can thrive in desert conditions and tends to like drier areas. All right, so you might be asking now what happened to the elevation component that I brought up in both of those questions, because I definitely didn't touch on it. But since it was the main component of both of those, I wanted to wait to the end to introduce them. So when I refer to elevation in this talk today, referring to this gradient that I created that runs perpendicular to the shoreline. And this line will correspond to these 4 distinct elevations, or you might see them labeled as blocks, where that block 1, elevation 1, is the one that's closest to the shoreline, and then the elevation 4/block 4 is the furthest upland. All right, so now what does all of that look like together? The seeding question plus the plug planting question, including the elevation components, and how does that look like when I set it up in my field? So here is my full study design. There's 3 slides I'll kind of like, and then able to see the bigger picture. For every block, I had 8 total plots. I was able to put both of my experimental questions on each of those blocks. There's 5 plots for testing the 2 different plugs, and then 3 plots for testing seeding density. And then I was able to kind of replicate 1 block up the elevations there. And so now I'm able to add elevation as a fixed effect in my models. And then just for statistical purposes, and because we had a nice lot of space, we were able to replicate that 5 times across that gradient, which was great. All right, so now that, but now that you have those all set up, we're going to dig into some findings. Oh, yes. I have to drag this over. 1 second for zoom land. I'll close this. How do you do that? Oh, I see it. Right here. Oh, nice. Okay. Okay, thank you. I'm glad there's closed captioning available. You hear me say and okay, but that's fine. All right, thank you for that. That's a nice break. So we'll set up now let's look into my findings. I gotta bring this back. Okay. Are we back?
Just click on the slide.
Okay, I think we're there. Okay, great. All right, so we're gonna have a second little speed bump here. So I want to talk about how I group the data because it's a little confusing. Because one of the ways that I created this seed mix is I really went out and surveyed the existing plant communities and on site. And so some of the existing plant communities that are out there are part of the seed mix. So there is kind of a strong overlap between what was seeded and what was native in the seed bank. That's particularly apparent in the first year, which you'll see in some further slides. So moving forward to look at any of these results, anytime I reference the word native there, which will always have like a green coating to it, I mean any native plant that came up that was not part of the seed mix, even if it was part of like the control plots, it was just, it was considered native. And then seeding means anything in the seed mix. And then of course, invasives are just on their own as invasive. Okay, so let's first look at the raw data from question 1. And I will have the questions up on the top so we'll know which one that we're talking about. And just a quick orientation, the top graph is 2021, the bottom graph is 2022. This is end of season or peak cover. And elevation panels are from left to right going away from the lake, and I have those little icons to kind of follow. The percent cover is on the y-axis, and then the seeding density is on the x-axis. And then once again, with this coloring, plant groups are the same as before. Red will be all invasives, green's natives, and blue are seeded. So one thing to kind of note before we dive into this, especially that first year's finding, that percent cover here can be over 100%. And that's a little confusing, but it's because individual species will be occupying those like different layers in the canopy. And when they added all their covers together, they can be more than 100%. And yeah, so with that, we can start talking about some of the findings. So something that I thought was really awesome is that first year in 2021, that invasive plant cover in red, those little red dots at the bottom, they were very minimal. So there wasn't a lot of invasives returning to the system. And like I mentioned, when we had that little speed bump, there was like overlap between the native background communities that first year and the seeded communities. And I'll talk more about that soon when we look more at community assembly. And then looking at the second year, you do see that we now have seeded plant communities still had highest cover, but there were high cover in the native communities. So we had more diversity coming in where like those greens are starting to kind of come up more as well. All right, so now let's look at some statistically modeled data. I have a little Enya joke, I thought would be appropriate. So for that, I ran a generalized linear mixed model, and I used either a beta distribution for seeded and invasive species for the cover data because it's bound between 0 and 1, or normal distribution for the count data for species richness. And then I also ran, with intense help from Susan Durham, a multi-dimensional ordination, which I used to visually assess species assemblage across the 3 seeding treatments, and that's really fun to look at. All right, so let's dive into the model data. I'll orient you here, kind of similar to before, where the seeding density is still on that x-axis. The y-axis, they're a little bit different. Those top graphs, it's the predicted seeded percent cover. The middle graphs, it's predicted invasive cover, and the bottom is predicted species richness. And then the left panels here are the 2021, and the right are the 2022. So one thing right off the bat is we did see that seeding had an effect in both years. You can see those significant codes are different than the control, which is great. But one thing we thought was super interesting is that there's no statistical difference between the seeding densities. So it didn't matter if I had a 1x or a 5x density, they just did well in this system. And then when you look at the invasive cover, you can see that it's actually low throughout both years, which is great, and all 3 treatments. That first year, there was a little bit of a significantly lower invasive cover, but that didn't carry through to the second year. And then when we look at species richness, you can see that both are very similar across the both years. And in 2021, you have significantly higher species richness in that 1x density, though really that only translated, if you can see the grade there, that only really translated to like 1 species or so on average extra. And then the next year, there was no difference between the seeding densities, but there was still a difference between the 1x and the control that was still significantly different. Yeah. Yep. Nope, I just seeded once in 2021 and then continuing the monitoring over both years. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. All right, so these are very similar to the last graph. The only thing is now we're looking across seeding elevation instead of looking at seeding densities. And once again, 2021 and the 2022, the percent cover, the top graphs, we did see that those lower elevations had significantly higher cover of seeded species. That first year, you can see the first two are significantly higher, the first two elevations, and that second year was the first three. So they really plants just really didn't like that higher, drier elevation. And then for invasive cover, we do see the lowest cover for invasive is in that first and second elevations of the first year. And then the second year, kind of similar to the seeded cover, is that they were in first, second, and third. But consistently, the higher elevations had both the highest invasive cover and the lowest seeded cover. All right, now these graphs are really fun. So at least I think so. So let's take a deeper look at species composition in that first year, which I did start to touch on a little bit earlier. So here we're looking at the raw mean covers again. And when I mean cumulative mean cover there on the Y, I just mean that they're all stacked in the same order that they appear in the legend. And then they're added together to get that total cover. And then the blues and grays there do still correspond to the seeded species, greens for native. And now the invasives are red and brown because they ran out of red colors, distinct red colors. And you can see that the majority of the raw cover here is in those seeded species. And there was a few dominant species that I will highlight in the panel here on your right. So the first one that was really big, and that's that big blue block across all of them, is that Biden species or the beggar ticks. And then the next kind of more like turquoisey block is the red root flat sedge or the Cyparius erythrorhizos. And then that third really major driving annual was that gray color across all of them, and that's Rumex marinimus or golden dock. So these seeds or these species, for the most part, were really big this year and not seen much the second year. They kind of have that live fast, die young mentality that a lot of seeded annual species have. And then I did want to note there was one particularly dominant seeded species that was not found in control plots, so was not part of the background community, and that was the Helianthus species. All right, so before we jump into the second year species composition, I wanted to highlight a few really cool trends I saw. So 2022 brought really big changes in the plant community out there, which was just magical to see. So this area 2 years prior was actually devoid of vegetation. And so just over these 2 years of monitoring, very, very large stands of cottonwood saplings had established along the bottom elevations in the monitoring area. And you can see here, that's one of our 6 foot tall Tex Cassie who's standing over there. And she's practically hidden by the cottonwoods. And so, yeah, that first year monitoring, we did see like a bunch of small ones coming out. And I kind of felt bad for them because I thought the whole area was going to be flooded and they would possibly perish. But there was a big lack of flooding due to the drought that happened in this area. And so it really allowed these cottonwoods to flourish. So at the end of my project, I basically had almost bushwhacked my way out of the forest to get out. We were like trying to haul things off site, and I grumbled a little bit, but they're just so magical. I'm glad they're there. And then I wanted to talk about the changes in the dominant plant community. So all of these little fuzzy flowers that you see there is that rayless aster. It's called the Symphotrichium salatum. And this actually replaced 2 of the main annuals that were seen the last year, which was the golden dock and the red root flat sedge. And then the sunflowers that I planted, they did spread out from the plots and they mixed with the cottonwood stands, as you can see here. And part of it basically became a sunflower garden. So how does that translate into total species assemblage for 2022? Well, don't worry, I have a graph for that. So this was very similar to the one before, so I won't orient you to it, but I do want to note that you'll see there's a lot more white space up top. And that's because I made sure to scale the y-axis the same so you can kind of compare it to the previous year where they were almost at 150. But so there was a drop in cumulative cover here, and we do fall under 100. And so let's look at this raw cover of species found in the second year. So there was that one annual that returned readily from the previous year, and that was that Biden species here in blue. And then we also had this saltgrass come in, the Dicyclus baccata, as well as both the common sunflower and the nettle sunflower. And so for the rest of the main species composition, you might be, I mean, you're not going to be surprised. It was mostly the cottonwood and that rayless aster. And then we did see an increase, unfortunately, it was still pretty small, but an increase in invasive cover. And this was particularly seen in those like top elevations over elevation 3 and 4. And the main ones that we saw was that the cattail, which is the brownish color there, and then the rabbit's foot grass, which is the black. So now let's take a bit of a different look at these data. I was curious as how the plant communities would assemble, like regardless of elevation. If I was just solely looking at all my control plots versus all my 1x versus all my 5x, like how do the species assemble within these communities, and is there anything interesting driving it? And so to do that, I ran a multi-dimensional ordination. And here's a quick little primer in case you're unfamiliar. So if they are closer together in this graph, then they're more likely to occupy the same space out in the field. If they're opposite each other in space, they're likely not co-occurring in the field. And the axes display this data in a way that best represents their dissimilarities, and this is done through a series of stress tests. And essentially, it collapses like a multi-dimensional space onto a 2D surface, so we can extract main points from it. And then I did want to note, I did remove rare plants from this before running, because one thing about ordinations like this is they don't take account like the number of counts of something, and even if it occurred like only on a couple plots, it could be put on here and we could take away something that from it, even though it wasn't really a big part of the community. And so if it occurred less than 5% of time in plots, I removed it before running these ordinations. All right, so this is what I found. This is the first year look at those community assemblies. So the 1x density, which is the more of like the orange color there, or the orange spider, and then the 5x density, the blue spider, we do see that they were more similar to each other than they were to the control plots. And this was backed up by the previous raw and model data that we'd shown, where it said there was really more of an effective seeding, but not really an effective seeding density. And yeah, you can see here that there was some particular plants that were part of the background community that was really driving it. And that was the tamarack. So the red ones are the invasive, so the tamarack, the chenopodium, and that Polygonum persicaria, the rabbit's foot grass. And then there was also the native sedge that drove these background communities. And then for seeded communities, we saw that Helianthus was a big driver, along with that saltgrass, the Biden species, golden dock, and then that invasive cattail. All right, and so now let's look at the following year. And I think it's super interesting to see them side by side, so you can kind of compare between the two of them. And I did keep them all with the same y and x-axis lines, so you can compare more easily. And so some really cool things. That first year, we did see that 13 species on average were driving the community assembly. But that second year, it was up to 22 species, which was amazing. Just a lot more diversity on site. And you can see too, in that second year, the spread of species is a lot more wider, indicating that there was more unique positions in space that these plants were occupying. And so one hypothesis around that spread is that was possibly due to niche partitioning, which is where essentially different species like divvy up the resources available in the environment, and so they don't really directly compete with each other. Okay, so that was a lot of graphs. So now we're gonna summarize them just so you have some clean things to take home when you're thinking about this talk. So what's the big picture here? So well, for the most part, we did find adding native seeds to the plots did increase native cover, but the density of seeding, like I said, wasn't statistically different from each other. So the effective seeding really wasn't there. Effective seeding density really wasn't there. But there was some nuances that are worth noting. So in that 1x density, we did see an increase in species richness, which is good, but we did also see an increase in invasive cover. And so why is this happening? Possibly it could be that adding less seeds to the plot meant that there was like more competition for resources, but that ended up, it was less competition for resources, but that meant that there was more resources for invasives to come in and take advantage of. All right, and now we're going to wrap up some elevation points. So I found that the lower elevations were best across all the treatments for overall seeded cover and the lowest invasive cover. And so yeah, this is likely due that drought was just a really large driving force in a lot of the trends that we saw here. And it just meant that those lower elevations just had more water access, and that really increased their chance for survival. Also, on the higher elevations, there were some stands of cattail, invasive cattail that were nearby that could have encroached or was encroaching on those upper elevation plots, and that decreased the native cover. All right, so I wanted to take a moment to look at some well data, because you might I did collect it while I was out there, but this is why I didn't present it earlier. So due to the immediate drop in lake level that happened, the wells basically dropped to the bottom and they dried out, and it happened so fast that I was really unable to incorporate water level data into my models. But I think it's interesting to look at here and really add some context. So you can see in 2021, you do see those water level fluctuations happening in that lower elevation. So those are on site. They were just a lot lower. These are all negative numbers, so this is all below ground. So it was a lot lower than we anticipated. And in that second year, we didn't even get that. It just was like drought right away. Things just dried up faster than the previous year. All right, now we're going to look at some results from my plug data. And just as a refresher, my questions were, does the addition of plug planting arrangement, and the elevation of planting impact native plant community recovery? All right, so the graphs here are very similar to the previous ones. You've seen the only big adjustment is now, instead of the group of species making up that blue planted cover, I just have a single species, which is the saltgrass here. And then that x-axis is now control, clumped, and dispersed plug planting arrangements, and then the y is still the percent cover. So when this is just looking at the raw data, you can see that those dispersed plug planting arrangements in the lower elevations had raw cover, which was the opposite of my predictions. I did predict that the clumped planting arrangement would do best in this system, but that was prior to realizing, we weren't omnipotent, but there was a big drought coming that would really just kind of flip everything on its head. And so, yeah, you can see that, so almost, I lost my train of thought, sorry. So 60% of total cover was happening in 2022, which is great. So you do see an increase in percent cover that second year. And in both years, across all three treatments and all four elevations, invasive cover really did remain remarkably low, which is great. All right, so now this is looking at modeling data for the saltgrass plugs. So I ran really similar models to my seeding density experiment. Here this is why it was kind of wordy for me in the last slide, is I did find a significant interaction between planting arrangement and elevation, which means that I couldn't parse out the individual effects, and I always have to present them paired because they really significantly interact with each other. And so as you can see here, dispersed plantings did in the model data have significantly higher cover the first year in 3 out of 4 elevations. In that second year, there was less significance between the planting arrangements, but they still had high cover. And like I said, the severe drought really just flipped everything around. All right, and now we're going to look at the second species. So I had similar results to the saltgrass. The dispersed plantings did lower, especially in those lower elevations. And the overall cover of hardstem bulrush, as you can see here, is also lower than we found in the saltgrass. But that likely had to do with a number of things. One thing is that percent cover is really a tough metric for bulrush. If you're familiar with the species, they're really columnar and they're very skinny. And also hardstem bulrush really doesn't like those higher elevations, really struggle to establish. It really just needs water to be happy. And so that second year, sadly, you do see a slight drop in cover, but they were still out there. And this is kind of one way which the hardstem differed from the saltgrass, where the saltgrass the second year really increased in cover and the bulrush decreased in cover. But I kind of have a little note on that. So statistically, there wasn't a big difference between planting arrangements. And that first year, there was a slight favor towards the dispersed, but overall, they did establish, except for in those higher elevations. So we would still recommend plug planting hardstem bulrush, as this is really such an important species for rebuilding habitat. And I just wanted to note that years ago, maybe like 5 years ago or so, there was about 300 plugs of this plant that were put on site by managers. And really, they've done so well. They've grown enormously in the past years. And there's some areas that are closer to the Siglal Inlet where there was just thousands of bulrush present to see. So this is still a really effective way to introduce a species. You just have to be really mindful of their access to water. So now in summary, the dispersed, like I said, dispersed planting arrangements in those lower elevations increase native cover in these systems. And so plugs can be a really great way to overcome that bottleneck that I talked about earlier of seed germination, where we lose 90 to 95% of our seeds. And overall, the lower elevations were best for both plugs, and that was regardless of their dry or wet adaptations. All right, so starting to wind it down here a little bit. So this is going to bring me to my last main topic that I love to cover, which is my extension publication. So this was a synthesis of the research that I just presented previously and some other research with a broader focus on that in eastern Great Basin region of the arid West. So there was an identified gap that we found for practitioners on guidance to wetland restoration. And a recent manager survey that was conducted by my lab in collaboration with some others in this room, they found that 75% of respondents said that there was a lack of extension documents with wetland revegetation focus. And so this was actually only the second most identified need, only behind the need for funding, which was shocking to see. And then in order to do that, I synthesized materials from peer-reviewed gray literature with my own field research and some needs identified in that manager survey. And the result is an upcoming extension document that you can see here. It's a very practical title. It's titled Best Practices for Lakeshore Revegetation in the Eastern Great Basin. And so I'm really, really proud to show you a few notable parts of this document. And I do want to recognize I had two co-authors on this, which was Karin Kennering, my advisor here, and then Ray Robinson, our current, but not for much longer, lab manager. And so in it, we highlight a main problem, and then we'll provide background on that problem, followed by how you would apply that to the field site. And so some of the backgrounds have accompanying charts and recommendations. So these are a few of the identified common barriers that we found to restoration. And I'm just going to highlight these three and we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into these. And the main three that I'll cover are unclear guidance on how to approach restoration, lack of knowledge on what species to use, and lack of knowledge on recommended planting methods. So for the first one, that unclear guidance on how to approach restoration, we highlight that first column, we highlight the considerations a practitioner would take into account when approaching a restoration project, followed by the questions to answer, and then some resources that can really help them answer these questions. And then to address the lack of knowledge on what species to use, we highlight species that have been found to have had high revegetation success in these areas. And these pages actually go on for about 6 pages or so. So here's the top 2. And so we include what type of plant they are, if they like sun or shade, and some notable adaptations that can help with restoration, like if they're drought tolerant, if they're herbivore resistance, if they have rapid growth, or if they have dense root structures, that would be like really ideal for shoreline stabilization. And the last section I want to highlight is addressing lack of knowledge on recommended planting methods. So as we talked earlier about 2 of the top ones, which was the seeds and the plugs. So they're highlighted here, but there are a few others. And we talk about their benefits and their drawbacks. And then we also do like a little definition. So yeah, we hope that this guide will empower others to restore the vegetation of lakeshores in the Eastern Great Basin and really ensure that these vital resources remain healthy for the future generations. And with that, I would like to say thank you to my funders, the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, Utah Department of Ag and Food, the Utah Agricultural Experimental Station, the whole Wetland Ecology and Restoration Lab, Susan Durham for the stats help, my committee members who are here, and my advisor, Karin Kennering, for believing me and supporting me through grad school during a pandemic, which was wow. And lastly, all my friends and family. And with that, I'll take any questions. Oh, yes.
When you're looking at the seeds,
Yes.
And the performance at the lower blocks versus the upper, you said the lower ones did better because they're wetter.
Mm-hmm.
But the well data suggests that other than the one squiggly line, everything's got dry everywhere very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So in what sense are the lower ones wetter?
That's a good question. I mean, the lake was still, it's a very movable lake because of that fetch and because of just the up and down. Like it does drop, but there is still water that is available to the plants and are especially available when they are younger and needed and are just trying to establish. And so I think that is where you do see those lower elevations having a little bit of a competitive, or like not competitive advantage, but advantage over those higher elevations because they are able to access water. Even though it does drop, pretty drastically, but I think it's still, you know, a lot of these have longer roots, and yeah, the water is still moving on the system, and in some ways because it is shallow. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes, Jody.
So you talk a lot about how the drought drove the data and the results. I'm wondering if you have any predictions with what's happening this year, because
Yes.
you know, we're still in a drought.
Yeah.
But we have a lot of water.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I wish that we were able to do one more year monitoring, because I just think it would be so fascinating to now see this extreme flooding that's going to happen in that situation likely. And so that is a wonderful question, and one that I've definitely thought a lot about. I mean, I anticipate that there'll be a lot of changes in the community. I don't know if any of like the annuals will be coming as much. I'm wondering how the cottonwood forest that's growing there, how that's going to survive. But obviously they are probably a little bit more established, and they can usually typically handle the inundation. But I think that we're going to see a drastic community change out there. And there are, I know Alana's work, she's currently has some plots out there, so she might be able to, when she presents her research next year, highlight kind of the flooding effect on her plots, which I think will be really interesting to see. But unfortunately, we don't get to see it for these plots, but I think it would have changed it a lot, especially with the plugs too. Yeah, great question. Oh, yes.
So I might have misheard this, but did you say when thinking about the seeded plant composition that in year 2 the diversity increased or like
Yes.
richness?
Yep.
I thought that was interesting because like that's kind of like contrasting from like range seedings where you see like this boom in diversity, mainly like forbs right away, and then it kind of decreases. So like, is that a common thing in wetlands where like it's kind of increasing, or does it decrease? Is there like data on long-term kind of monitoring?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for this system, I think a big driving force that first year was that background community, which was that those fast growing forbs like the Bidens and the Remix marinimus. And I think those, one thing about them is that they do come in a lot earlier, which is good because they can provide forage habitat, but then they die off really young. And then I think possibly what was happening is that my seeded communities was able to kind of have access to resources then, because there was more light and more water available for them because the other things had died off possibly. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting finding that second year had higher diversity on site, and there was a really robust background community there, and we were finding some rare plants out there. Like it was just quite wonderful to see. And so yeah, there's a lot of it. Some of it is obviously a addition of my seedings, but I also have to give a shout out to just like the manager did such a great job at cutting back Phragmites and cutting back the invasives. And they didn't expect to see it, but the native plant community is returning. Good to see. Yeah, thanks for that.
We've got land managers on Zoom who want to know when the extension publication is going to be out.
Oh, that's a great question. We did get the reviews back from the extension, and we're currently now, it's part of my thesis, so I'll get some great reviews from my committee here. But hopefully, I don't know, by the end of the summer, by middle summer, I don't know if Brian has any, she's just nodding at me, yeah. Yeah. Later, because I think it's a really interesting document. I'm pretty proud of it. Yeah.
Because of the huge fluctuations that you have out there, would you recommend planting diverse seed base or diverse plugs to sort of hedge your bets whether whether we have a drought year or a flood year?
Yeah, that is a really great question, and it's something I'm still kind of synthesizing. But I mean, I say the kind of the overarching like Pollyanna approach is like the more ways you can increase biodiversity, the better these systems do. There's the more forage habitat, they can have more variety of insects, which increases, birds, and there's just like a lot of top down and bottom down effects. So I think if it's fiscally possible, I think that seeding higher diversity is always the best. And I think diversifying bugs would be super interesting. I know these are only single species, but I think bug planting is just a really great way to kind of overcome that seed germination barrier that we find with seeds and seed-based restoration, but it is more costly. So yeah, that's a big question. Yes.
So rather than bed hedging, why not just cheat and irrigate?
We thought about that.
As a means of saying, we don't know if it's gonna be here or here, so if it's here, we'll irrigate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great way to ensure that at least water access isn't a barrier to germination. Yeah, I think if you can do it, I mean, this field site was, one thing was it was like 2 hours away, but we did it when we were first kind of talking about the site and talking about how we were gonna set up this research. One of the things we floated was, what if we irrigated, and we tested like, not irrigating versus irrigating. But it is just so much more time intensive, and we were just looking for more things that were scalable, since we are kind of delivering a lot of these results directly to the land managers. And yeah, but I think irrigation could have done a lot. But yeah, Alex.
Did you draw that?
No, I didn't. I wish I had. I have the credit, I should put it here. It's like Carson Ellis. It was from the same New Yorker piece that I had that Amy Crew quote from. I pull it up, but it's kind of ghastly to try to back up slides over here. But yeah, isn't it beautiful? I know. I wish I had that talent. What did you say? Oh yeah, the snakes. They're part of the ecosystem too.
Okay, if there aren't any further.
Oh yeah, there's one more.
Oh, there was one more.
We have it. Sorry,
If
Spencer.
no one else, I was just curious, like, is there any literature on like, how do these plantings like migrate in terms of like elevational plantings, like?
Yeah. I don't, as of right now, I mean, I can't say anything, 100%, but I really struggled to find papers that manipulated elevation as part of their research component. And so I don't know if one even had that incorporated. There's kind of like, there's only a few papers I did that I found, or just even the migration. So that's a great question. As of right now, I haven't read anything on it, but I'm sure they're out there, or it's, since these systems are not unique, especially this is something that happens on lakeshores and reservoirs especially in the Eastern Great Basin, there is that fluctuating. I think that it's, applicable. And so either papers are going to be coming, or it's just a question people maybe are just like asking if, or land managers are doing without actually putting it in writing, or, it's a lot there, but great question. Oh, sorry, Erin.
What's your favorite water body in Utah?
Bear Lake. You can swim in it. I'm from like the Midwest in Minnesota, and you like trip on lakes, like they're everywhere. And I just was like swimming all the time, and then I was like, "What? You can't swim in Utah Lake? Utah Lake is a lot healthier than people say it is." But I just swim in it. So, but yeah, Bear Lake. I love Bear Lake. I love that the rock weathering changes the color to like aqua colors. Thank you for that, sweet.
Okay, let's thank Jes.